Hello, dear friends, and welcome back. Now, I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine a grand English hotel, dressed in all its Christmas finery, garlands of holly draped along the banisters, candles flickering gold in every window, and the faint, cheerful sound of a piano playing carols somewhere deep inside. Snow falling gently outside, mulled wine warming in crystal glasses, laughter echoing through oak-paneled corridors. It sounds perfectly lovely, doesn't it? But on this particular Christmas Eve, at the Grand Eversley Hotel in the quiet county of Dorset, something went terribly, quietly wrong. A man was found dead on the snow-covered balcony below, and everyone agreed it was a tragic accident. A little too much to drink, a slippery railing, a terrible fall. Everyone agreed. Except one small, sharp-eyed elderly lady, sitting quite still on her own balcony above, knitting, watching, and noticing the things that no one else thought to notice. Her name, of course, was Miss Marple, and she knew, from the very first moment, that this was no accident at all. Now then, dear friends, as the story unfolds, I want you to watch closely. The clues are all there. Can you spot what Miss Marple spotted before she reveals it herself? Let us begin. The Grand Eversley Hotel. The Grand Eversley Hotel had stood at the edge of Whitmore Village in Dorset for very nearly 100 years, and in all that time, it had never looked quite so handsome as it did on the evening of the 24th of December, 1953. Someone, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Brent most likely, for she was the sort of woman who took enormous personal pride in such things, had wound fresh holly and trailing ivy along every banister from the ground floor right up to the third. Thick red ribbon had been tied in generous bows at each newel post. In the entrance hall, a Christmas tree of quite extraordinary height stood between the two front windows, decorated with glass baubles of deep red and gold, and topped with a star that caught the light of the chandelier above and sent small, cheerful sparks dancing across the ceiling. Outside, the snow had been falling since mid-afternoon. It fell softly and without any particular hurry, the way snow tends to fall in the English countryside when it has no intention of stopping. By 6:30, the gravel drive had disappeared entirely beneath a smooth white blanket, and the yew hedges that bordered the hotel garden had become great, rounded shapes, silent and rather ecclesiastical in the grey-blue evening light. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfect Christmas Eve. Miss Jane Marple had arrived 2 days prior, on the 22nd, at the suggestion of her niece, who had grown quietly anxious about the fact that Miss Marple had spent the previous Christmas entirely alone in St. Mary Mead, with only a pot of soup and a rather unsatisfactory detective novel for company. The niece had booked the room, arranged the taxi, and seen Miss Marple onto the train with the firm, affectionate manner of someone who loves a person very much and finds them occasionally exasperating. Miss Marple had not objected. She was 73 years old. Her left knee had been troubling her since October, and the truth, which she would not have admitted to her niece for anything in the world, was that she had been feeling rather more tired than usual these past few months. Not ill, precisely. Simply tired. The kind of tired that settles into the bones after a long year and does not entirely shift with a good night's sleep. A few days in a comfortable hotel, she had decided, was really a perfectly sensible idea. Her room was on the second floor, room 14, and it was a good room, not large but well proportioned, with a window seat, a writing desk of dark mahogany, and a small balcony that looked out over the rear garden and the snow-covered lawn beyond. The bed had a proper feather mattress, the hot water ran reliably, and the maid who brought her morning tea, a cheerful girl named Daisy, knocked at exactly the right moment each day, which Miss Marple appreciated more than she would have thought possible. She had brought her knitting, naturally. A cardigan in pale blue wool, intended for her great niece. She had been working on it in a rather leisurely fashion for the better part of 3 weeks, and it was coming along quite nicely. The other guests had been arriving throughout the day of the 24th, in various states of Christmas cheer. Miss Marple, who had developed the habit over many years of sitting quietly in public rooms and observing the world without appearing to do so, had been in the residence lounge since 2 o'clock that afternoon, her knitting in her lap and a pot of Earl Grey at her elbow. She had therefore had ample opportunity to form her first impressions of her fellow guests by the time dinner was announced at 7:30. There were, she noted, 7 of them, aside from herself. The most immediately noticeable was Mrs. Eleanor Vane. She arrived at 3:15 with 2 leather suitcases and the quiet, composed manner of a woman who has been beautiful for so long that it has simply become a fact of life, like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. She was perhaps 50, dressed in deep charcoal grey, not quite mourning, but close to it, with a single strand of pearls at her throat. Her hair was silver blonde, swept back from her face with elegant simplicity, and her expression, when she paused in the entrance hall to remove her gloves, was one of perfect, practiced serenity. She was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of woman about whom people invariably said she has had such a difficult time of late, without being entirely certain what the difficulty had been. She was travelling alone. The second guest of note was Mr. Gerald Ashworth, who arrived at 4 o'clock in a very large motor car and made rather more noise about it than was strictly necessary. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, red-faced, with a loud, confident laugh that seemed to precede him into every room by several seconds. He wore a well-cut suit that had probably cost a great deal of money, and a gold watch on his left wrist that had certainly cost more. He spoke to the porter with the easy, familiar condescension of a man who has spent a lifetime assuming that people in service are primarily there for his convenience. Miss Marple had known several men of precisely this type over the years, and she had found, without exception, that there was always something underneath the bluster. Sometimes it was insecurity, sometimes it was calculation. Occasionally, it was something considerably less pleasant than either. With Mr. Ashworth, she was not yet certain which it was. He was accompanied by his wife, Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, a thin, quiet woman of about 45, with pale brown hair and the particular, careful stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. She smiled when spoken to, agreed with everything her husband said, and had eyes, Miss Marple noticed, that moved constantly, not nervously, exactly, but watchfully, as though she had long since developed the habit of knowing exactly where everyone in a room was standing at any given moment. The fourth guest was a young man named Mr. Philip Rowe, 28 or 30, Miss Marple estimated, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and the slightly rumpled, distracted look of someone whose mind is perpetually elsewhere. He carried a small leather satchel and checked into the hotel with the absent, automatic manner of a person who has checked into many hotels and found them all essentially interchangeable. He nodded pleasantly enough to the other guests in the entrance hall, but made no effort at conversation, and retreated to a corner table in the lounge almost immediately, where he sat with a glass of water and appeared to be thinking very hard about something. He did not, Miss Marple thought, look like a man on holiday. He looked like a man who had come somewhere for a reason. The remaining guests were a family, the Holloways. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway were a comfortable, cheerful couple in their early 60s, the kind of people who fill any room they enter with an immediate sense of warmth and good-natured noise. They had brought with them their daughter, Miss Caroline Holloway, who was perhaps 30, with her mother's round face and her father's tendency to speak slightly too loudly in enclosed spaces. The Holloways, it became clear within approximately 10 minutes of their arrival, had been coming to the Grand Eversley Hotel for Christmas, every year for the past decade. They knew Mrs. Brent, the housekeeper, by name. They knew which table in the dining room had the best view of the garden, and they had opinions, strongly held and freely shared, about the relative merits of this year's Christmas tree versus previous year's efforts. They were, in short, entirely comfortable, entirely familiar, and entirely at ease. Miss Marple found them rather restful to observe. Dinner that evening was a cheerful affair. The dining room had been dressed with candles and more holly, and the kitchen had produced a very creditable roast goose, followed by a Christmas pudding that arrived at the table accompanied by a small blue flame and a round of appreciative applause from the Holloways. Miss Marple ate a moderate amount, drank a small glass of hock, and listened. She was good at listening. She had always been good at it. People, she had observed over a very long life, rarely said the most important things directly. The important things were in the pauses, in the small glances exchanged across a table, in the questions that were almost asked and then quietly swallowed. Mr. Ashworth talked a great deal during dinner, about business, about the drive down from London, about the hotel's wine list, which he found disappointing. His wife Dorothy agreed with everything he said, in a small, steady voice, and ate very little. Mrs. Eleanor Vane sat at a table by herself, and was perfectly pleasant when addressed, but offered nothing voluntarily, and kept her eyes, for the most part, on her plate. Mr. Philip Rowe ate quickly, accepted a glass of wine he barely touched, and excused himself from the dining room at 8:20, noticeably earlier than anyone else. Miss Marple watched him go. She was tired by 9 o'clock, more tired than she would have liked to be, and slightly cross with herself about it. Her knee ached. She gathered her knitting, wished the Holloways a good night, and made her way upstairs with the assistance of the banister, which she held rather more firmly than she once would have needed to. In her room, she changed into her nightgown, took the small glass of warm milk that Daisy had left on the nightstand, and sat for a few minutes in the chair by the window, looking out at the snow. It was still falling. The garden below was entirely white and perfectly still, lit in pale gold by the light spilling from the hotel windows. She had intended to read. She had a library book, a rather good one, about birds of the Somerset marshes, sitting on the nightstand beside the milk. She had been looking forward to it. Instead, she found herself simply sitting, looking at the snow, and thinking about nothing in particular. She was asleep in her chair by 9:30, her knitting still in her lap, the library book unopened. She did not hear, at 11:20, the sound of raised voices somewhere above her. She did not hear, at 11:34, the short, terrible sound that followed. But at 11:37, when the screaming started, sharp and sudden and quite impossible to sleep through, Miss Jane Marple opened her eyes. The man on the balcony. The screaming came from somewhere below, and to the left, a woman's voice, high and ragged, with the particular quality of sound that cuts straight through sleep and pulls a person upright before they have properly understood why. Miss Marple was on her feet before she was fully awake. This surprised her, slightly. She stood in the middle of her room in her nightgown and her wool bed socks, her heart beating rather faster than she would have liked, and took 3 deliberate breaths. Her knee protested the sudden movement. She ignored it, the way one ignores an old complaint that has nothing useful to add to the present situation. The screaming had stopped. In its place was something almost worse, a rising murmur of voices, doors opening along the corridor, the rapid, uneven sound of footsteps on the stairs. Miss Marple put on her dressing gown, her slippers, and her glasses, in that order. She took a moment to locate her room key on the nightstand. Then she opened her door. The corridor was already filling. Mrs. Holloway had emerged from room 12 in a pink dressing gown, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her husband stood just behind her in striped pajamas, his face creased with sleep and alarm. Young Caroline Holloway appeared a moment later, wide-eyed, her hair in a long plait over one shoulder. From the far end of the corridor, Mrs. Brent, the housekeeper, came moving at a pace that was not quite running, but was as close to it as a woman of her considerable dignity would permit. She was fully dressed, or nearly so, her dark dress buttoned hastily and not quite straight, and her face wore the expression of a person who has been dreading something of this kind for a very long time and is grimly unsurprised to find it has finally arrived. "Please remain in your rooms," she said, in a voice that was admirably steady. "There has been an incident in the garden. Please remain in your rooms, and I will come to each of you directly." Nobody remained in their rooms. Miss Marple, who had not expected they would, moved quietly to the window at the end of the corridor, a tall sash window overlooking the rear garden, and looked out. The snow in the garden below was still and white and undisturbed across most of its expanse. But on the stone-flagged terrace directly beneath the third-floor balconies, perhaps 30 feet below where Miss Marple now stood, there was a dark shape in the snow that had not been there when she had looked out at 9:30. A man, lying quite still, face down, one arm bent beneath him and the other flung wide, his dark dinner jacket sharp against the white. Around him, the snow was not entirely undisturbed. There was a young woman standing at the edge of the terrace. The maid, Daisy, Miss Marple realized, still in her apron, her hands clasped together at her chest. Not screaming now, but making a small, repeated sound that was somehow more distressing than the screaming had been. Miss Marple looked up, above the body, to the third-floor balconies. There were 4 of them, identical wrought-iron structures, each with a low railing, jutting from the rear face of the hotel at regular intervals. The third one from the left had its glass door standing open, a thin curtain moving in the cold night air. She noted this carefully. Then she looked back down at the man in the snow. By midnight, the hotel had transformed itself from a place of Christmas festivities into something considerably less comfortable. The local police had been telephoned, Sergeant Alan Dowd and a young constable named Pitts, and they arrived at 12:20 in a motorcar that had some difficulty with the snow on the drive. Dr. Fellows, who served as the village doctor and occasional police surgeon, arrived 12 minutes after that, breathing heavily and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco, his bag in his hand. The guests had been assembled in the residence lounge. Mrs. Brent had been very firm about this, and the firmness of her manner had apparently impressed even Mr. Ashworth, who had begun to object and then thought better of it. They sat in various states of undress and anxiety, the Holloways together on the large sofa, Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth in separate armchairs, Mrs. Eleanor Vane on the upright chair nearest the window, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that was either admirable or studied, depending on one's point of view. Mr. Philip Rowe was not in the lounge when Miss Marple arrived. He came in approximately 4 minutes later, from the direction of the main staircase, rather than the corridor that led to the guest rooms. He was still fully dressed, his dinner jacket on, his tie slightly loosened, and there was a brightness about his eyes that could have been distress, or cold, or something else entirely. Miss Marple, who had taken the armchair nearest the door and was sitting with her hands folded over her knitting bag in her lap, watched him find a chair near the fireplace and sit down without speaking to anyone. She thought he was not in his room. She filed this observation away in the orderly, well-practiced manner she had developed over many years of noticing things, and turned her attention to Sergeant Dowd, who had come into the lounge with his notebook and his rather self-important manner and was preparing to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sergeant Dowd said, with the gravity of a man who does not often find himself in charge of anything more serious than a disputed fence line and is making the most of the occasion. "I regret to inform you that a man has been found deceased in the rear garden of this hotel. He has been identified as Mr. James Lorrimer, a guest in room 23 on the 3rd floor. At this time we are treating the matter as a tragic accident. It appears the gentleman may have lost his footing on his balcony and fallen." There was a murmur in the room. Mrs. Holloway made a small, distressed sound. Mr. Ashworth cleared his throat loudly. Miss Marple looked at the faces in the room. Mrs. Eleanor Vane did not move. Not a flinch, not a flicker, not the slight involuntary tightening around the eyes that people produce when they hear something they were not expecting. She simply sat, her hands folded, her face composed, and looked at Sergeant Dowd with an expression of mild, appropriate concern. This, Miss Marple thought, was very interesting indeed. She cast her mind back over the dinner table. Mr. James Lorrimer had not been at dinner. She had not, in fact, seen a Mr. James Lorrimer at any point during the day. Room 23 was on the 3rd floor, above her own room. She had not known his name until this moment, and yet Mrs. Eleanor Vane, upon hearing that name for what should have been the first time, had produced no reaction whatsoever. People always reacted to names, even the most composed people, upon hearing the name of a deceased stranger announced in a room where they are sitting in their dressing gown at midnight on Christmas Eve, produced something. a slight shift, a glance at their neighbours, a murmured "who?" The absence of any such reaction was, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, itself a very loud reaction. She said nothing. She filed this away with the other thing. Sergeant Dowd proceeded to take brief statements from each guest in turn, conducted with a thoroughness that was more methodical than penetrating. He established that no one had seen Mr. Lorrimer that evening, or so everyone said. He established that Mr. Lorrimer had checked in that afternoon at 5:30, alone, with a single small case. He established that his room, when examined, contained nothing of obvious interest: a change of clothes, a briefcase, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the writing desk. He did not establish where Mr. Philip Roe had been between the time he left the dining room and the time he appeared in the lounge. Miss Marple noticed that he had not asked. She also noticed, when Dr. Fellows came in briefly to speak to the sergeant in a low voice near the door, that the doctor's expression was not quite the expression of a man confirming an unfortunate accident. It was slightly more careful than that, slightly more guarded. After the doctor left, Sergeant Dowd announced that the guests were free to return to their rooms, that no one should feel alarmed, that it appeared to be a very tragic accident, and that he would be speaking to everyone again in the morning, simply as a matter of procedure. The guests dispersed. There was quiet conversation in the corridor, the Holloways speaking in low, shocked tones, Mr. Ashworth making a remark to his wife that Miss Marple did not catch, Mrs. Vane walking to the stairs without speaking to anyone. Philip Roe went last of all, and as he passed through the door of the lounge, he paused for just a moment, not long enough to be noticed by most people, and glanced back into the room with an expression that Miss Marple, who had not moved from her chair, recognized without difficulty. It was relief, not grief, not shock, not the unsettled distress of a man who has just heard that someone has died nearby. Relief. Miss Marple sat for another few minutes after he had gone, her knitting bag in her lap, the fire burning low in the grate. Her knee was aching. She was tired, genuinely tired, in a way that she did not bother arguing with at this hour of the night. There would be time enough in the morning, but there were, she thought, 3 things that wanted thinking about. First, Mrs. Eleanor Vane had recognized the name James Lorrimer, and had taken considerable care not to show it. Second, Mr. Philip Roe had not been in his room when a man fell from the floor above, and had looked relieved, not distressed, upon learning of the death. Third, and this was the one that bothered her most, in the quiet, persistent way that the important things always bothered her, was something she had seen from the corridor window when she had looked down at the body in the snow. The snow on the terrace around Mr. Lorrimer's body had been disturbed. Not greatly, and not in the way it would have been disturbed if someone had rushed out to help him after the fall. It was disturbed in a different way, in a small, careful way, close to the body, in a pattern that suggested not distress, but deliberation, as though someone had been there, in the snow, before the maid Daisy had arrived and started screaming, as though someone had crouched down beside the body and done something, or taken something, and gone quietly back inside. Miss Marple rose from her chair, somewhat stiffly, and made her way upstairs. She did not sleep well, but then she had not expected to. Miss Marple listens. Christmas morning arrived at the Grand Eversley Hotel, in the way that Christmas mornings sometimes do after a night of bad news, quietly, tentatively, as though unsure of its welcome. The snow had stopped falling some time before dawn, and the garden below Miss Marple's window was a smooth, unbroken white in every direction except the terrace, which had been cordoned off with a length of rope that someone had tied between 2 iron plant stands and which flapped gently in the cold morning air. Miss Marple had been awake since 6:30. She had lain in bed for a while after waking, her eyes on the ceiling, going over the 3 things she had noted the previous night, and finding that they had not diminished in significance with the passage of sleep. If anything, they had grown slightly more insistent, the way genuinely important things tend to do, pressing quietly against the mind like a finger on a bruise. She got up, washed her face in cold water, the hot tap was slow this morning, dressed herself carefully in her grey wool dress and her good cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and sat down in the window chair with her knitting. She did not knit. She simply sat and looked at the garden and thought. Her knee was considerably better this morning, which was something. Daisy arrived with the tea at 7:15, and she was not her usual cheerful self. Her eyes were slightly swollen. She had been crying, Miss Marple thought, and not recently. She set the tray down with careful mechanical movements, and was turning to go when Miss Marple said, gently, "Daisy, dear, are you all right?" The girl stopped. For a moment, she stood with her back to the room, her shoulders very straight, and then she turned around, and Miss Marple saw that she was holding herself together by a fairly narrow margin. "I found him, ma'am," she said. "Mr. Lorrimer. I was the one who found him." "I know," Miss Marple said. "Come and sit down for a moment if you like. Just for a moment. I shan't keep you." Daisy hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the chair by the writing desk, her hands twisted together in her lap. "I'd gone out to bring in the log basket," she said, "from the covered store by the back wall. Mrs. Brent likes the log basket filled first thing Christmas morning before the guests are up. I always do it." She paused. "He was just lying there, in the snow, and I thought at first, I don't know what I thought." "It must have been a very great shock," Miss Marple said. "The snow around him," Daisy said, and then stopped. Miss Marple looked at her with attention. "Yes?" The girl frowned, a small, uncertain frown, the frown of someone who has had a thought they cannot quite justify and are not sure whether they should voice it. "It looked, I don't know, it looked a bit funny. Around him like. Not the way it ought to look if he'd only just fallen. There was, like someone had been crouching there, near his hand." She looked up at Miss Marple with anxious eyes. "I expect I was imagining it. The sergeant said it was an accident." "What do you think?" Miss Marple asked, mildly. Daisy opened her mouth, closed it again, and then said quietly, "I don't know, ma'am. I only know what I saw." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Daisy. You've been very helpful, and very brave." She paused. "I wonder, the gentleman in room 23, Mr. Lorrimer, did you ever bring him his tea? Did you see him yesterday at all?" Daisy shook her head. "He only arrived late, ma'am. 5:30 or thereabouts. I didn't see him myself, but Jenny on the front desk checked him in. She said he was—" She hesitated. "Yes?" "She said he seemed a bit agitated, ma'am. Not ill exactly. Just not settled, like he was expecting something." Another pause. "Or someone." After Daisy had gone, Miss Marple poured her tea and drank it slowly, and thought about a woman she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Caroline Purvis, who had been widowed at 47, and had thereafter conducted herself with such impeccable, gracious composure that the entire village had agreed she was a saint. It had taken Miss Marple approximately 3 weeks to notice that Mrs. Purvis's composure was not, in fact, the composure of a woman at peace. It was the composure of a woman who had learned, over a very long marriage, that any visible emotion was likely to be used against her. She thought about this for some time in connection with Mrs. Eleanor Vane. Then she put on her coat, her scarf, and her good walking shoes, and went downstairs. The residence lounge at 8:30 on Christmas morning had the subdued, careful atmosphere of a room full of people who are each privately deciding how much of what they feel they are willing to show. The Holloways were at their usual table near the window, Mr. Holloway with a newspaper he was not reading, Mrs. Holloway with a cup of tea she was holding in both hands as though for warmth, young Caroline staring at the snow in the garden with a distracted expression. Mr. Ashworth was standing by the fireplace with a cup of coffee, his back to the room. His wife Dorothy sat in the armchair behind him, and she was doing something that Miss Marple observed with quiet interest. She was watching her husband's back with an expression that she immediately rearranged into mild blankness when she heard Miss Marple's footstep at the door. Quick, Miss Marple thought. She was very quick about that. Mrs. Eleanor Vane was not in the lounge. Philip Rowe was not in the lounge. Miss Marple wished everyone a gentle good morning, declined Mrs. Holloway's immediate and warm invitation to come and sit with them. She was fond of the Holloways, but this was not the morning for warm conversation. and settled herself in the armchair she had occupied the night before, near the door, with her knitting. She began to knit. The pale blue wool moved steadily through her fingers. She listened. Mr. Ashworth spoke first, as she had expected he would. He turned from the fireplace after a few minutes and addressed the room at large, in the tone of a man who considers himself the natural chairman of any gathering he happens to be part of. "Damned business," he said. "Damned unfortunate business. I've spoken to Dowd this morning, the sergeant, and apparently they're fairly satisfied it was an accident. Man had been drinking, slipped on the balcony railing." He shook his head with the vigorous sympathy of someone who is not very sympathetic. "These old hotels, the railings want checking. I've always said so. Someone should have checked the railings." "Did you know him?" Caroline Holloway asked. "Mr. Lorrimer?" "Never met the man in my life," Ashworth said. His wife Dorothy, behind him, looked down at her hands. It was not much. It was the very smallest possible movement. A slight drop of the eyes, a fractional tightening of the fingers where they rested on the arm of the chair. The kind of thing that is invisible unless one is watching for it, and invisible even then unless one knows what one is looking for. Miss Marple was watching for it, and she knew what she was looking for. She thought, Dorothy Ashworth has heard the name James Lorrimer before today. She let this settle in alongside the other things and continued to knit. Sergeant Dowd arrived at 9 o'clock, accompanied again by the young Constable Pitts, and proceeded to conduct his follow-up interviews with each guest individually, using the small sitting room off the entrance hall for the purpose. He was there most of the morning. The guests went in one at a time and came out again, the Holloways looking saddened but uncomplicated, Mr. Ashworth looking impatient and self-important, his wife looking as she always looked, careful and quiet and perfectly blank. Philip Rowe came downstairs at 9:30, ate a small breakfast at a corner table alone, and went in to see the sergeant at 10. He came out 15 minutes later and went immediately back upstairs without speaking to anyone. Miss Marple went in to see Sergeant Dowd at 10:30. She told him what she had seen from the corridor window, the disturbed snow near the body, in a mild, tentative manner, the manner of an elderly lady who is not quite sure whether what she noticed is worth mentioning, and is a little worried about wasting everyone's time. She had found, over many years, that this was by far the most effective approach with policemen of Sergeant Dowd's particular type. He listened with polite attention, thanked her, and wrote something in his notebook that she rather suspected was not what she had told him. He did not ask her what she thought it meant. Mrs. Eleanor Vane came down to the lounge at 11 o'clock, dressed in a different shade of grey from the day before, lighter this time, almost silver, and carrying a small book that she set on the table beside her without opening. She ordered coffee from the young waiter and sat with the self-contained stillness that Miss Marple had noticed the previous evening. Miss Marple waited until the coffee had arrived and the waiter had withdrawn, and then she said pleasantly from across the room, "I do hope you managed to sleep a little, Mrs. Vane. What a very dreadful night it was." Mrs. Vane looked across at her with the composed, courteous expression she appeared to wear as a matter of course. "A little, thank you. And you?" "Oh, not terribly well," Miss Marple admitted. "I'm afraid I'm not as young as I was, and these disturbances take rather longer to settle than they once did." She paused and knitted 2 stitches and then said, in exactly the same mild conversational tone, "Did you ever come across a Mr. Lorrimer previously? I only ask because I understand he was from London, and I thought perhaps—" "No," Mrs. Vane said. "I didn't know him." She said it without a flicker, without a pause, without the fractional hesitation that most people produce when they are lying about something that matters to them. She said it cleanly and completely and with perfect composure. And then she picked up her book and opened it, and the conversation was over. Miss Marple knitted on. She had not expected Mrs. Vane to crack. Not yet. Not here. Not in a lounge full of people on Christmas morning. That was not how women like Eleanor Vane operated. Women like Eleanor Vane had learned to be composed under pressure at such a young age that composure had become not a performance, but a second skin. "You did not get through it by pressing," You got through it by waiting and by watching for the moments when a person's second skin was not quite covering everything. There had been such a moment, just now. Most people would have missed it. When Miss Marple had said the name Lorrimer, Mrs. Eleanor Vane's right hand, the one resting in her lap, not the one holding the coffee cup, had closed, very slowly and very quietly, into a fist. She had answered the question with her face perfectly still and her voice perfectly even, but her hand had closed, and it had not opened again. At 11:30, while the Holloways were in the lounge and Mr. Ashworth was telephoning someone from the box in the entrance hall, Miss Marple put down her knitting, excused herself, and went upstairs. She did not go to her own room. She went, quietly and without hurrying, to the end of the second-floor corridor, where a door led to the back staircase. She went up the back staircase to the third floor. The third-floor corridor was empty and rather cold. The window at the far end had been left slightly open, and the air coming in off the snow outside was sharp and clean. She walked along the corridor until she reached room 23. The door was closed. A length of rope had been tied across it, not police tape, simply a piece of rope, the kind a sergeant from a small Dorset village might have in the boot of his car. It was not locked, it was simply closed, with a rope across it, which was intended to indicate that no one should enter. Miss Marple looked at the rope for a moment. Then she looked up and down the empty corridor. Then she ducked carefully under the rope, rather more carefully than she once would have needed to, and with a brief private acknowledgement that her left knee was making its feelings known, and went inside. The room was cold and undisturbed. The bed had not been slept in. It still wore its counterpane, smooth and neat, with the hotel's small embroidered pillow at the center. The briefcase was on the writing desk, where the sergeant had mentioned it, and the whiskey bottle was beside it. Not half empty, as Dowd had said, but perhaps a quarter gone. Not enough, Miss Marple thought, for a man to lose his footing on a balcony he had presumably stepped onto deliberately. She did not touch the briefcase. She looked at the writing desk. There was a hotel notepad beside the whiskey bottle, and on the top sheet something had been written and then torn away. She could see the faint impression of the pen on the sheet below, not enough to read, but enough to know that something had been there. She looked at the balcony door. It was closed now. Someone had closed it since last night, presumably the constable. She opened it carefully and stepped out. The balcony was narrow, perhaps 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with a wrought iron railing across the front that came to approximately mid-chest height on a standing adult. The railing was solid. She put her hand on it and pressed, firmly. It did not move. It did not wobble. It was cold and damp from the snow, but it was entirely, unmistakably solid. She stood on the balcony for a moment in the cold Christmas air, looking down at the terrace below, at the cordoned-off patch of snow, at the smooth white expanse of the garden beyond. A man did not fall over this railing by accident. The railing was too high. The surface was not icy, it was simply wet, the way stone gets wet in the English winter. A man would have to go over this railing deliberately, or be assisted. Miss Marple stood there for a moment longer than she had intended. The cold got into her bones in the way that cold does at 73, in a manner it simply did not at 43, and she felt it, felt the tiredness underneath it, the tiredness that her niece had worried about, and that she herself had been quietly ignoring for several months. She went back inside, ducked back under the rope, and stood in the corridor for a moment, her hand on the wall, just breathing. Then she straightened up and went back downstairs. There were, she now thought, not 3 things to consider. There were 4. The solid railing was the 4th. James Lorrimer had not fallen from this balcony. He had gone over it, or been sent over it. And the whiskey on the desk was there for the same reason the disturbed snow near the body was there, not as a consequence of what had happened, but as an explanation for it. Placed there, arranged. Someone had been very careful. Someone had been very nearly careful enough. Shadows behind the tinsel. There is a particular kind of afternoon that descends upon an English hotel when something terrible has happened the night before, and the world outside is snow-locked and silent. A suspended, airless quality, as though the building itself is holding its breath. The Grand Eversley Hotel had that quality on Christmas afternoon. The decorations looked different in it. The holly seemed less cheerful. The red ribbons at the banisters had a slightly funereal air that Miss Marple suspected they had always possessed, and that the candlelight of the previous evening had simply been kind enough to conceal. Luncheon had been a muted affair. Mrs. Brent had ensured that everything was served correctly and on time, because Mrs. Brent was the sort of woman who considered the correct service of meals to be a moral position as much as a professional one, and no amount of death or police rope in the corridors was going to alter that. The food was good. Nobody ate very much of it. Sergeant Dowd had departed at 12:30 with his notebook and his constable, having announced once again that the matter appeared to be a tragic accident, and that he would be in touch if anything further was required. He had the satisfied air of a man who has done what was asked of him and is not inclined to ask anything further of himself. Miss Marple had watched him go from the entrance hall window and felt the familiar, mild frustration of knowing something that the official channels had not yet found their way to knowing, and being, for the moment, unable to do very much about it. She went to her room after luncheon, lay down on the bed for 40 minutes, and slept. She had learned, at 73, not to feel guilty about this. The mind worked better for rest, and hers had a considerable amount of work ahead of it. She came back downstairs at 2:30, with her knitting and her wits in better order, and positioned herself once more in the armchair by the lounge door. The fire had been built up and the room was warm. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to thin. December afternoons in Dorset gave very little in the way of daylight, and what they gave, they took back early. She had, over the course of the morning, gathered 4 facts. What she needed now were the connections between them, the threads, as she privately thought of them, that ran beneath the surface of each person's behavior and tied them, invisibly, to one another and to the dead man on the terrace. She began, methodically, with what she knew about each of them. Gerald Ashworth was not, Miss Marple had decided, a complicated man. He was the kind of man who appeared complicated, who filled a room, who spoke with authority, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who has never been seriously challenged, but underneath the performance, she suspected, the machinery was fairly simple. He wanted money and status and the particular satisfaction that comes from being seen to have both. What she did not yet know was what connected him to James Lorrimer. She thought about his behavior at dinner the previous evening, the loud, proprietorial manner, the wine list complaints, the way he had spoken to the porter. She thought about his voice in the entrance hall this morning when he had been on the telephone, not the words, which she had not been able to make out, but the tone, low, rapid, and with an edge of controlled urgency that was quite different from his usual bluster. She thought about the way his wife Dorothy had looked down at her hands when he said he had never met James Lorrimer. Gerald Ashworth, Miss Marple thought, had met James Lorrimer. The question was where, and in what capacity, and what had passed between them. Business, most likely. Everything about Gerald Ashworth suggested that his real life, the life that mattered to him, was conducted in the world of business. And James Lorrimer, according to what little Sergeant Dowd had revealed, had been some variety of financial consultant based in the City of London. That was a world in which a man like Ashworth and a man like Lorrimer might very easily have found themselves in the same room, found themselves, perhaps, on opposite sides of something. She filed this and moved on. Dorothy Ashworth was, in some respects, the more interesting of the two. Miss Marple had observed quiet women all her life. St. Mary Mead had produced more than its share of them, women who moved softly through their domestic arrangements, who agreed with their husbands in company and said very little in their own right, who were overlooked as a matter of course by everyone around them. She had learned, over many years, that such women divided fairly cleanly into 2 kinds. The first kind were genuinely, contentedly quiet, women for whom the domestic world was sufficient and satisfying, who had no hidden reservoirs of feeling or thought that the quietness was concealing. The second kind were were quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. Dorothy Ashworth was the second kind. Miss Marple was quite certain of it. She thought about the way Dorothy watched her husband's back across the lounge this morning. Not with the anxious, habitual watchfulness of a woman who is afraid of her husband, though there might have been an element of that too. It was something else. Something more specific than fear. It was the watchfulness of a woman who knows something and is waiting to see whether it is going to surface. She knew about James Lorrimer. Miss Marple was now quite sure of that. The question was what she knew, and whether what she knew was the same thing her husband knew, or something different, or something more. Miss Marple had noticed, at luncheon, that Dorothy Ashworth had looked once, briefly, carefully, and then quickly away, at Mrs. Eleanor Vane. Not at her husband, at Mrs. Vane. This was, Miss Marple thought, potentially the most important thing she had observed all day. Philip Rowe was the person who puzzled her most, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that this puzzlement contained a degree of frustration. She did not like being puzzled by young men. She had encountered rather too many of them over the years to feel that she ought to be puzzled by them at this stage of her life. He was not what he appeared to be. That much she was sure of. The distracted, rumpled, absent-minded manner was real enough in its way. She did not think it was entirely performed. But there was something underneath it that was neither distracted nor absent-minded. Something watchful. He had left the dining room early. He had not been in his room when the body was discovered. He had come into the lounge from the direction of the main staircase rather than the guest corridor. He had looked relieved. She turned these facts over carefully, the way one turns over stones in a garden, to see what is living underneath. He was young, 30 at the most. He was not, she thought, a wealthy man. His suit was good but not new, his satchel was well worn, and he had the particular independence of movement that belongs either to someone very rich or someone with no one waiting for them at home. She suspected the latter. He had come to this hotel for a reason, not for Christmas, not for the snow or the goose or the carol-playing pianist in the dining room. He had come because someone else was going to be here. She thought about what Daisy had said. He seemed agitated, like he was expecting something, or someone, that had been said of Lorrimer. But it could, equally, have been said of Rowe. Two men arriving at the same hotel on Christmas Eve, each expecting something, or someone. She thought, had they known each other, or had they each come, independently, because of a third person? She looked across the lounge at the empty chair by the window, the chair that Mrs. Eleanor Vane had occupied that morning, and she thought about this for a long time. Eleanor Vane. Miss Marple had been saving her, in the way one saves the most demanding piece of needlework for when the light and one's patience are both at their best. She was a widow. This much Miss Marple had gathered from the careful neutrality with which Mrs. Brent had referred to her at dinner the previous evening, and from the grey she wore, and from the particular self-sufficiency of her manner, the manner of a woman who has learned to rely entirely on herself because there is no one else to rely on. Not recently widowed. The grief, if there had been acute grief, had settled into something quieter and more permanent. A year, perhaps two. She was travelling alone at Christmas, which told its own story. A woman of Eleanor Vane's composure and evident background did not spend Christmas alone in a hotel because she preferred it. She did so because the alternative, family, friends, the well-meaning company of people who knew her history, was, for reasons of her own, less bearable than solitude. She had a past. That was what Miss Marple kept returning to. Not a shameful past, necessarily. She was not a woman who radiated guilt or anxiety, or any of the other emotional weather that accompanies a genuinely bad conscience. But a complicated past. A past that had loose ends. A past that had, apparently, followed her here to the Grand Eversley Hotel in the form of a man named James Lorrimer, who had arrived agitated and expecting someone, and who was now lying in the cold storage of a Dorset mortuary. Had she known he was coming, or had his arrival been the thing that had unsettled her, that perfect composure applied like pressure to a wound to stop the bleeding? And there was the matter of the fist, the closed fist in her lap when she heard the name, the hand that had not opened again, People closed their hands around things they were afraid of losing, Miss Marple had found, or things they were afraid of being taken from them. She was so deep in thought that she almost missed it. Almost. It was 3:30, and the lounge had emptied slightly. Mr. Holloway had gone to telephone his son in Edinburgh. Caroline Holloway had gone upstairs, and Gerald Ashworth had planted himself in the corner with a whiskey and a 3-day-old newspaper. The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth got up from her chair, crossed the lounge in her quiet, careful way, and went out into the corridor. Miss Marple counted to 15. Then she put down her knitting, rose from her chair, and followed. Dorothy Ashworth had not gone far. She was standing in the entrance hall near the foot of the stairs, and she was not alone. She was speaking to Mrs. Eleanor Vane, who had apparently been coming down the stairs at the same moment, or who had, perhaps, been waiting. Miss Marple stopped in the shadow of the corridor doorway, out of the light, and watched. She could not hear what was being said. The two women were speaking quietly, too quietly for the words to carry, and their faces were turned slightly away from her. But she could see their postures, and postures, she had long since decided, told you almost as much as words. Dorothy Ashworth was tense. Her shoulders were raised and her hands were clasped in front of her. The posture of someone who has screwed their courage to the sticking point and is determined not to let it slip. She was speaking rapidly, in short phrases, her eyes fixed on Eleanor Vane's face. Eleanor Vane was listening. Her face was as composed as always, that beautiful practiced composure, but her body had shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a very still person shifts when something has startled them, and they have suppressed the startle before it reached the surface. Then Dorothy said something, 2 or 3 words, very quietly, and Eleanor Vane went still, in a different way. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of someone who has just heard something that has changed the shape of the room around them. She looked at Dorothy Ashworth for a long moment. Then she said something in return, equally brief. Dorothy Ashworth nodded once, sharply. Then she turned and walked back towards the lounge, and Miss Marple stepped back into the shadow of the doorway and let her pass, and Dorothy did not see her. Miss Marple waited until the footsteps had receded, and then she looked back at the entrance hall. Eleanor Vane was still standing at the foot of the stairs. She had her hand on the newel post, the carved wooden newel post with the red Christmas ribbon tied at its top, and she was looking at nothing in particular, and her face, for just this moment, in this empty entrance hall with no one she knew watching, was not composed at all. It was frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened, in the way that composed women allow themselves to be frightened only when they believe they are entirely alone. Miss Marple stood very still in the shadow of the corridor doorway and watched Eleanor Vane's face and felt the last piece of the puzzle she had been missing begin, very quietly, to take its shape. She had been asking herself what Eleanor Vane was afraid of losing. She thought she understood now. It was not a thing. It was not money, or reputation, or any of the other tangible commodities that people generally committed terrible acts to protect. It was a person. Miss Marple went back to the lounge, sat down in her chair, and picked up her knitting with hands that were, she noticed, not entirely steady. She was tired. She was quite genuinely tired, and the tiredness had a weight to it this afternoon that she did not entirely like. But there was no help for it. The thread was in her hand now, and once you had the thread, you followed it. That was simply the nature of the thing. She began to knit and to think, and outside the windows of the Grand Eversley Hotel, the last of the Christmas afternoon light faded from the snow-covered garden, and the darkness came in quietly from all sides, and the red ribbon decorations glowed in the lamplight, warm and festive, and entirely, perfectly misleading. The thread unravels. There is a moment in the resolution of every tangle, whether it is a knot in a skein of wool or a knot in human affairs, when the thread that has been pulled taut suddenly gives, just slightly, and you feel it in your fingers before you see it with your eyes. You know, in that moment, that the whole thing is about to come loose. You know which end to pull and how hard and in which direction. Miss Marple had that feeling at 4:20 on Christmas afternoon, sitting in the armchair by the lounge fire with her knitting in her lap and the pale blue cardigan growing steadily longer, and she sat with it for a while, the feeling, and let it settle, and made sure of it, before she did anything at all. She was not, she reminded herself, as young as she had been. She could not afford to pull the wrong thread. At 40, a mistake of this kind was an inconvenience. At 73, with a bad knee and a growing sense that her reserves of energy were not what they once were, it was something she could considerably less afford. She needed to be certain before she moved. She went over everything once more, carefully and in order. James Lorrimer had come to the Grand Eversley Hotel on Christmas Eve with a purpose. He had been agitated on arrival, expecting someone. He had not come down to dinner. He had, at some point during the evening, gone out onto his third-floor balcony and gone over the railing. The railing was solid. The whiskey on his desk was insufficient to have made a steady man unsteady. Someone had been at the body before Daisy arrived. Something had been taken. These were the facts, as Miss Marple understood them. Now for the connections. Eleanor Vane had recognized Lorrimer's name and concealed the recognition with considerable skill. She had a past with complications and loose ends. She was frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened, and the fear had surfaced only when she believed herself unobserved. She was the sort of woman about whom people said, "She has had such a difficult time," without knowing precisely what the difficulty had been. The difficulty, Miss Marple now believed, had a name, and the name was connected to whatever James Lorrimer had known about her. Lorrimer had been a financial consultant. Financial consultants, in Miss Marple's experience, occasionally consulted on matters that went somewhat beyond the purely financial. Men who moved in the circles of other people's money were very well placed to learn other people's secrets. And secrets, in the wrong hands, had a monetary value all their own. Blackmail was an ugly word. Miss Marple had never found any point in dressing it up. Blackmail was what it was, the exploitation of another person's fear, and it was, in her view, one of the very few sins that had no redeeming complexity to it whatsoever. She believed James Lorrimer had been blackmailing Eleanor Vane. She believed he had come to this hotel because she was here, had discovered she would be here, somehow, and had followed, because blackmailers are, almost without exception, people who cannot leave well enough alone. She believed Eleanor Vane had killed him, but there was a but. There was always a but in Miss Marple's experience, and it was the buts that separated a genuine solution from a merely convenient one. The but was this: Eleanor Vane was a composed, careful, intelligent woman. She was not impulsive. She was not the kind of person who, upon finding herself confronted by a blackmailer on a hotel balcony, simply pushed him over the railing and hoped for the best. That was not how Eleanor Vane operated. People who had spent years maintaining composure under pressure did not suddenly abandon it in a moment of crisis. They were more likely, in Miss Marple's experience, to do precisely the opposite, to become, under acute pressure, even more controlled, even more deliberate. Which meant that if Eleanor Vane had killed James Lorrimer, she had planned it. She had not lost her temper on a balcony. She had gone up there, or lured him there, knowing what she intended, and she had done it, and then she had come back down and been composed about it, and the whiskey and the stage scene were part of the plan, not an afterthought. This was a different kind of killer from the impulsive, frightened kind. This was the kind that was considerably harder to catch. And then there was Dorothy Ashworth. Miss Marple put down her knitting, pressed her fingers together in her lap, and thought about Dorothy Ashworth with considerable care. Dorothy Ashworth knew something. That was established. She had looked down at her hands when her husband said he had never met Lorrimer. She had looked, once, at Eleanor Vane during luncheon, and she had sought Eleanor Vane out this afternoon, in the entrance hall, and said something, 2 or 3 words, that had stripped the composure from Eleanor Vane's face, like paint from a wall. What could Dorothy Ashworth have said, in 2 or 3 words, that would frighten Eleanor Vane in a way that nothing else had? Miss Marple thought about this for several minutes. Then she thought, "I saw you." 2 words. Or 3, with a name. I saw you, Eleanor. That would do it. That would do it precisely. Dorothy Ashworth had seen something. Last night, from a window perhaps, or from a doorway, or from her own room, if her room had any angle on the third-floor balconies. She had seen something, and she had held it close all through the night and all through this morning, and then this afternoon she had taken it to Eleanor Vane directly, which was either a very brave thing to do or a very foolish one, or possibly both. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. Then she thought, and why would Dorothy Ashworth go to Eleanor Vane rather than to the police? There were several possible answers to this question. The most straightforward was that Dorothy Ashworth had her own reasons for wanting the police kept at a distance from the events of last night. Reasons that connected to her husband. Gerald Ashworth had also known James Lorrimer. His wife's face had told Miss Marple that much. And Gerald Ashworth was a man who dealt in money, and in the kind of confidence that money provides, which meant he, too, was the sort of man whose affairs might occasionally attract the attention of someone like Lorrimer. Was it possible that Lorrimer had been blackmailing both of them, separately, unknown to each other? It was, Miss Marple thought, not only possible, but entirely in keeping with what she knew of the type. A man who lived by other people's secrets would naturally accumulate several. And a Christmas hotel full of people trying to enjoy themselves was, in its way, an ideal location for a quiet meeting. The kind of meeting that could be explained away as coincidence if it ever came to light. Except that it had not been quiet, and it had not ended in a meeting. She needed to speak to Philip Rowe. She had been circling this conclusion all day, the way one circles a thorny problem in a garden, aware of it, noting its dimensions, approaching it from several angles before committing to an approach. Philip Rowe was the piece that did not yet fit cleanly, and in Miss Marple's experience, the piece that did not fit cleanly was invariably the most important one. She found him at 5 o'clock, in the small reading room at the back of the hotel that most of the guests had not discovered. A narrow, book-lined room with a single window overlooking the side garden, 2 leather chairs, and the faint, pleasant smell of old paper and dust. He was sitting in one of the chairs with his satchel open on his knees and a look of such complete and private absorption that she felt briefly guilty about interrupting him. Only briefly. "Mr. Rowe," she said pleasantly, "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I was looking for somewhere quiet to read, and Mrs. Brent mentioned this room." He looked up. Something moved across his face, a rapid sequence of calculation and decision, too quick to follow in its particulars, but recognizable in its general character. He was deciding, in that moment, who she was, and what she knew, and whether she was a problem. "Not at all," he said, with a smile that was genuine enough in its way, but had the quality of something produced to order. "Please." Miss Marple settled herself in the second chair, arranged her knitting in her lap, and said nothing for a few minutes. She had found, over many years, that silence was the most underused tool in the human conversational repertoire. Most people could not bear it, most people rushed to fill it, and what they filled it with was very often considerably more informative than what they had intended to say. Philip Rowe lasted approximately 90 seconds. "Awful business," he said. "Last night." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Dreadful." "Did you know him at all, Mr. Lorrimer?" The same rapid sequence of calculation. No, I didn't." "I only ask," Miss Marple said mildly, "because I noticed that you left dinner rather early last evening, and I thought perhaps—" She paused, and let the pause do its work. "Perhaps you had arranged to meet someone, as one does, in a hotel, during the Christmas period." Philip Rowe looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is revising his estimate of the elderly lady sitting across from him. "I'd gone for a walk," he said. "In the snow? At that hour? I needed air." "Of course," said Miss Marple agreeably. And then, after a moment, "Mr. Rowe, I am going to say something rather direct, and I hope you will forgive an old woman for it. I have been watching people in this hotel since last night, and I have formed some views about what happened to Mr. Lorrimer. I believe the police will eventually form the same views, though it may take them somewhat longer." She paused. "If there is something you know that is relevant to what happened, I would gently suggest that it is considerably better to have said it now than to have it discovered later. In my experience, the truth has a way of surfacing regardless of one's preferences in the matter. The silence this time was of a different quality. Philip Rowe sat with his satchel in his lap and looked at the window, and the muscle in his jaw moved once. "I was a journalist," he said at last. I was working on a piece. About Lorrimer." Miss Marple said nothing. "He wasn't just a financial consultant," Rowe said. He was speaking quietly now, the produced smile entirely gone, replaced by something more tired and more real. He'd been doing it for years. Collecting information on people, compromising information, and using it, quietly. Never anything that could be proved outright. He was very careful. He glanced at her. "I'd been following him for 4 months. I knew he'd be here because I'd found a letter. In his office. I have contacts." He stopped. "I was going to confront him last night, after dinner." "But you didn't," Miss Marple said. "I went up to his floor at 10:30. I was going to knock on the door." He stopped again, longer this time. The door was already open, just slightly, and I stood there in the corridor, and I could hear voices. Inside the room, 2 voices. Could you distinguish them? Not clearly, a man, Lorrimer, and a woman. I couldn't hear the words. And then he pressed his lips together. I lost my nerve. I went back downstairs. I told myself I'd go back later, when he was alone. He looked at his hands. I didn't go back later. By the time I thought about going back, there was screaming from outside, and I realized he did not finish the sentence. "The woman's voice," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you have any sense, any impression at all, of age, or manner, or calm?" he said immediately. "That's what I remember. She sounded very calm, considering." He looked at Miss Marple, considering that they were clearly arguing about something. A calm woman's voice, arguing with a blackmailer in his room at 10:30 on Christmas Eve, and calm. Miss Marple thought of Eleanor Vane, standing at the foot of the staircase with her hand on the newel post, and her face, for one unguarded moment, stripped of its composure. The composure had been there in Lorrimer's room. It had only slipped for a moment, alone in the entrance hall, hours later. That told her something important about Eleanor Vane, and it confirmed what she had already suspected. "Thank you, Mr. Rowe," she said quietly. "You have been very helpful indeed." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to have a conversation," Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting. "And then, I think, we are going to need Sergeant Dowd back." She rose from the chair, slowly, with one hand briefly on the armrest, because her knee was registering its opinion again, and she saw no point in pretending otherwise, and crossed to the door of the reading room. "Miss Marple," Philip Rowe said behind her. She paused. He'd been blackmailing her for 2 years. I found the records. Whatever she did, it was to protect someone else, not herself. He hesitated. "I don't know if that matters." "To you?" Miss Marple stood in the doorway for a moment. "It matters a great deal," she said. "It almost always does." She went out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand on the wall, her eyes closed, just thinking. To protect someone else. She thought of the fist, closed around something invisible. Not money, not reputation, a person. She thought of Eleanor Vane's face in the entrance hall, that stripped, genuine, unguarded fear. And she thought, who was Eleanor Vane protecting? Who was the person that James Lorrimer had been holding over her for 2 years? The lever he had used to extract whatever it was he had extracted. The reason she had paid and paid and paid, until paying was no longer something she could do. The answer, she thought, was probably in this hotel. She opened her eyes, straightened up, and went to find Eleanor Vane. Cold truth on Christmas morning. She found Eleanor Vane in her room. This required knocking, which Miss Marple did, 3 times, quietly, with the particular knock that is neither tentative nor demanding, but simply certain, the knock of someone who has decided that the door will be opened and is prepared to wait until it is. There was a pause of perhaps half a minute. Then the door opened. Eleanor Vane was still dressed, the silver grey from this morning, the pearl necklace still at her throat. She had been sitting by her window, Miss Marple could see, because the chair was angled towards the glass, and there was a book on the sill, face down, that had the look of something picked up and set down many times without any of its contents being absorbed. The room was neat, almost unnaturally so, with the neatness of a person who controls their immediate surroundings because the larger surroundings are beyond control. She looked at Miss Marple for a moment without speaking. "May I come in?" Miss Marple said. Another pause. Then Eleanor Vane stepped back from the door. Miss Marple sat in the chair by the writing desk. Eleanor Vane sat in the chair by the window, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The pearl necklace caught the lamplight. Outside, the garden was entirely dark now, the snow invisible except where the light from the hotel windows fell across it in pale gold rectangles. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Miss Marple allowed the silence to exist without rushing it. She had found that the silences before very important conversations had their own necessary duration, and that cutting them short was rarely useful. "You know," Eleanor Vane said at last, "it was not a question." "I know a good deal," Miss Marple said, honestly. "Not everything, not yet." Eleanor Vane looked at her with eyes that were, Miss Marple thought, considerably older than the rest of her face. They were the eyes of a woman who has been tired for a very long time and has become so practiced at not showing it that even she has half forgotten it is there. "How much does it matter?" Eleanor Vane said quietly. "Why something was done. In the eyes of the law, I mean, not in any other sense." "In the eyes of the law," Miss Marple said, "it matters considerably, in terms of a jury, and a sentence, and a great many other practical things. The why of it matters enormously." She paused. "But I think what you are really asking is whether it matters to me. And the answer to that is yes. It matters a great deal." Eleanor Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked out of the window at the dark garden. "His name," she said, "was David." She told it in the way that people tell things they have been carrying for a very long time. Not quickly, not with the stumbling, emotional release of someone finally unburdening themselves, but slowly and precisely, as though she had rehearsed it in her head so many times that the rehearsal had become the story. David Vane was her son. 26 years old, a painter, living in a rented studio in Kensington that was far too cold in winter and that he refused to leave because the north-facing light was, he said, irreplaceable. He was. Eleanor Vane's voice did not change as she said this, but something in her face did, very slightly, the best person she had ever known. She said this without sentimentality and without apology, as a statement of fact. 2 years ago, David had been involved in an accident, a motor car, on a wet November night, on a road outside Oxford. A young man had been injured, seriously, though he had recovered. David had not been drinking. He had not been reckless. But he had panicked, in the aftermath, in the way that young people sometimes panic, and he had not stopped. He had driven on, and told no one, and spent 3 weeks in a state of private anguish before confessing the whole thing to his mother. Eleanor Vane had, at that point, made a decision. She had consulted a solicitor, quietly, privately, without involving David, and had been told that the legal consequences, while not necessarily catastrophic, would be serious. David's career was just beginning. He had a show arranged at a small but respected gallery in Cork Street. Eleanor Vane had decided, on the basis of all of this, that the thing to do was to handle it, to make reparations, generous, anonymous reparations, to the injured party, and to ensure that the matter went no further. She had managed all of this with the same composed efficiency with which she appeared to manage everything, and it had worked. The matter had, indeed, gone no further. David's show had happened. The gallery had sold 12 paintings. He was, 2 years later, doing well. Enter James Lorrimer. She did not know precisely how he had found out. She had her suspicions, The solicitor's office had not been as discreet as it should have been, she thought, or perhaps Lorrimer had simply been in the habit of watching for exactly this kind of thing, the way a particular species of creature watches for a particular kind of weakness in its prey. He had approached her 14 months ago at a function in London. He had been charm itself. He had made it entirely clear, in the most civilized possible terms, what he knew and what he intended to do with it if she was not cooperative. She had paid him. She had paid him 4 times over the course of a year, and each time she had believed, or permitted herself to believe, that it was the last time. It was never the last time. It was never going to be the last time. She understood that, by the end. She understood it with perfect clarity. He wrote to me, she said. 3 weeks ago, he had found out that I would be here. I don't know how. I have a friend who works at this hotel, and I had written to her. I can only think that the letter was, that it came to his attention somehow. She paused. He said he would be here. He said he wished to discuss he used the word arrangement. A new arrangement. The existing payments were no longer sufficient. He wanted more. A great deal more. A sum I could not. She stopped. A sum that would have required me to sell my house. Miss Marple sat quietly and listened. I agreed to meet him, Eleanor Vane said. That evening, in his room. I had decided, by then, that I was going to tell him that it was finished, that he could do what he liked, that David was old enough, now, to face what he had done, and that I was going to stop. She looked down at her hands. I had told myself this, very firmly, all the way down from London on the train. I told myself this. But, Miss Marple said gently. But when I sat in that room and looked at him, Eleanor Vane said, and he told me what he intended to do, and how he intended to do it, and who he intended to tell, and the precise, particular way in which David's life would be dismantled. She stopped. Her hands, in her lap, were quite still. There was a letter opener on his desk, one of those old-fashioned ones, quite heavy, with a brass handle. He had turned away from me. He was at the drinks cabinet, and she stopped again. The silence stretched. I struck him, she said, from behind. Once, very hard, at the back of the head. He fell immediately. He didn't make a sound. Her voice had become almost entirely flat now. Not the composure of performance, the flatness of someone who is describing something that they have not yet fully permitted themselves to feel. I stood there for some time. I don't know how long. Then I checked, and he was still alive, but not responsive. And I understood then what I was going to do, and I did it. She had dragged him to the balcony. It had been, she said this with a kind of bleak, exhausted honesty, very much harder than she had imagined. He was not a small man. She was 51 years old and not strong. It had taken a long time, and she did not want to describe it in detail, and Miss Marple did not ask her to. She had arranged the whiskey before she left. She had taken the letter opener with her. It was in her room now, at the back of the wardrobe, wrapped in a silk scarf. She had checked the corridor before leaving. She had been, she said, very calm. She was always calm in the moment. It was afterwards that she had difficulty. I went back to my room, she said, and I sat in this chair, where I am sitting now, and I waited for it to be over. She looked out at the dark window, and then, this morning, Dorothy Ashworth came to me in the entrance hall and told me she had seen me come out of his room. She had been coming down the corridor, she couldn't sleep, she said, and she had seen me come out of room 23 and go to the staircase. What did she ask of you? Miss Marple said. Nothing, Eleanor Vane said, and something in her voice shifted slightly, the faintest note of something that was not quite surprise. She didn't ask for anything, she just told me what she had seen, and then she said, she paused, she said she was sorry, that she knew what it was to want to protect someone, and that she would not be speaking to the police. Miss Marple thought of Dorothy Ashworth and her quiet, watchful eyes, and her hands looking down when her husband lied, and she thought she understood Dorothy Ashworth a great deal better now. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, here we are. Eleanor Vane looked at her directly for the first time since she had begun speaking. "Yes," she said. "Here we are." A pause. "You're going to call the sergeant?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I am." Eleanor Vane nodded, slowly, once. "David," she said, Will what I have told you tonight, the truth about your son's accident, will need to come out as part of this," Miss Marple said, and she said it as gently as she could, but without softening it, because false comfort was a cruelty dressed as kindness, and Eleanor Vane was not a woman who deserved that particular cruelty. "But I will make certain that Sergeant Dowd, and whoever else becomes involved, understands the full context of it, the blackmail, the length of time it went on, the sum you paid." She paused. "And the reason." "He's a good person," Eleanor Vane said. "David, whatever he did that night, he is genuinely a good person. That is not a mother's blindness. I have tried to see him clearly all his life. He is a good person who did a frightened thing." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. And she did. She believed it completely, the way she believed the things that rang true, not because she had been persuaded of them, but because they aligned with everything she understood about human nature, the way good people did terrible things out of panic, and the way the people who loved them sometimes did worse things out of love. She rose from the chair. Her knee was very bad this evening, the worst it had been all week, and she did not try to conceal the effort it took. There was no one here, in this quiet room, who required her to pretend to be steadier than she was. "I'll ask Mrs. Brent to telephone the sergeant," she said. "I should think he will be here within the hour." She moved towards the door and then paused with her hand on the frame. "Mrs. Vane, is there a telephone call you would like to make before—" "Yes," Eleanor Vane said. "I'd like to call David." "I'll ask Mrs. Brent to make the line available to you," Miss Marple said. "You'll have time." She went downstairs slowly, one hand on the banister, the holly and the red ribbons passing under her hand as she descended, and found Mrs. Brent in the corridor outside the dining room, and spoke to her quietly, and Mrs. Brent's face went through several things in quick succession before arriving at the particular expression of a woman who is deeply shaken and intends to be entirely competent regardless. Then Miss Marple went into the residence lounge, where the fire was burning low, and the Christmas tree in the entrance hall beyond was still lit, its glass baubles catching the light in small, warm points of red and gold. And she sat down in her chair, and she picked up her knitting, and she did not knit. She sat with her hands resting on the pale blue wool, and she thought about Eleanor Vane upstairs, and David Vane in his cold Kensington studio, and James Lorrimer, who had known too much about too many people, and had, in the end, used that knowledge once too often. She thought about Dorothy Ashworth, who had seen and said nothing to the police, and everything to the woman concerned, and what that said about a person. She thought it said something rather complicated and rather human, and that she was not entirely certain it was wrong. She thought, inevitably, about the nature of justice, a subject she had returned to many times over the years, without ever arriving at a conclusion that fully satisfied her. The law was one thing. Justice was sometimes the same thing, and sometimes something different, and the gap between them was where most of the genuine human tragedy resided. She had learned not to paper over the gap. It was better, she had found, to simply acknowledge it was there. She was tired, deeply, genuinely tired, the kind of tired that goes all the way down, past the bones, into something less definable. She thought of her niece, who had sent her here for rest, and felt a faint, wry affection for the gap between what had been intended and what had transpired. Sergeant Dowd arrived at 6:07, and he was, to his credit, more capable than she had given him credit for when it mattered. He listened to Miss Marple's account with growing attention and diminishing self-importance, and by the end of it, he was writing quickly in his notebook, and had lost entirely the air of a man wrapping up an inconvenient accident. He went upstairs. Philip Rowe, whom Miss Marple had sent a brief note to via the young waiter, appeared in the lounge at 6:15, and sat down without being asked, his satchel in his lap, and looked at her. "It's done," Miss Marple said simply. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Was I right?" about who it was. You had formed a view. I had formed a suspicion. Mrs. Vane. He looked at the fire. I didn't want it to be her. No, Miss Marple agreed. I didn't either. She paused. She was protecting her son. He had made a mistake, and Lorrimer had been using it against her for over a year. She said this because Philip Rowe had said it mattered, about protecting someone else, and she thought he deserved to know he had been right. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he looked at his satchel. The piece I was writing, he said, about Lorrimer, his other victims. There were others. I have most of the documentation. Then I would suggest, Miss Marple said, that the documentation makes its way to the appropriate people. Not for the purposes of a newspaper article, for the purposes of, she considered the word, accounting. He looked at her steadily. All right, he said. He left shortly after, and Miss Marple sat alone in the lounge with the fire and the knitting and the decorated tree visible through the open doorway, and the sounds of the hotel settling around her, footsteps on the floor above, a door closing somewhere, the distant, muted conversation of the Holloway family in the dining room, where they had gone for their Christmas supper with the particular resilience of people who have agreed, collectively, not to let something terrible prevent them from doing the decent, ordinary things. She approved of this, broadly. Life had to continue. It always had to continue. That was both its cruelty and its considerable mercy. At 7:30, Daisy brought her a cup of tea without being asked, and set it on the table beside her, with a look that was still sad, but somewhat less frightened than it had been this morning, and Miss Marple thanked her and meant it. She drank the tea. She picked up her knitting. The pale blue cardigan grew by another 2 rows in the quiet of the Christmas evening. She thought about her niece, and the train home, and the birds of the Somerset marshes waiting patiently on her nightstand. She thought, next Christmas, she would stay in St. Mary Mead. And then she thought, she had thought that last year too. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one, and turned her knitting, and began the next row. Outside the windows of the Grand Eversley Hotel, the snow lay over the garden in the dark, cold and white, and perfectly still, undisturbed now, covering everything. As snow, in the end, always does.